I'm Harry Anderson, and I never thought I'd be standing in a funeral home listening to my own family call me a thief. But there I was, 26 years old, wearing a borrowed black suit that didn't fit right, while my cousins screamed that I'd stolen their inheritance. They said I'd manipulated our grandmother in her final months, convinced her to change her will, and robbed them of what was rightfully theirs. The accusations cut deep because I knew they weren't true, but proving it seemed impossible until the lawyer opened that sealed envelope and read words that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Grandma Rose's funeral started like any other Tuesday in October. Rain tapped against my studio apartment window in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, steady but heavy. I'd been dreading this day for weeks, not just because I'd lost the only person who truly understood me, but because I knew what was coming. The vultures were circling, and they all wore the same last name as me. I pulled on the black suit I'd bought from a thrift store downtown. The sleeves were too long, the pants too loose, but it was all I could afford on my construction worker's salary. As I adjusted the tie in my cracked bathroom mirror, I caught sight of the photo taped to the corner. It was me and Grandma Rose from last Christmas, both of us laughing over a game of checkers in her sunroom. She was wearing that ridiculous reindeer sweater I'd given her, the one my cousins had mocked behind her back. The drive to Riverside Funeral Home took me through the wealthy part of town where my cousins lived. Their houses stood like monuments to success, with perfectly manicured lawns and luxury cars parked in circular driveways. I passed my cousin Derek's mansion first, then Miranda's estate with its fountain out front. These were the homes that old oil money had built, the fortune that had been in our family for 3 generations. I parked my dented pickup truck between Derek's BMW and Miranda's Mercedes, feeling like a rust stain on polished silver. The funeral home was one of those places that tried too hard to look dignified, with heavy curtains and fake flowers that smelled like chemicals instead of earth. I walked through the front doors and immediately felt the weight of stairs. They were all there already, clustered in their expensive black clothing like ravens on a telephone wire. Derek stood near the casket with his wife Sandra, both of them whispering urgently. Miranda was by the guest book, her designer dress probably costing more than I made in a month. Her husband Paul nodded along to whatever she was saying, his gold watch catching the light from the chandelier overhead. Then there was Uncle Victor, Grandma's youngest son and the family's unofficial patriarch since Grandpa died. He was holding court near the back of the room, surrounded by aunts and cousins I barely recognized anymore. When he saw me walk in, his conversation stopped mid-sentence. I made my way to the front row, the one traditionally reserved for immediate family. Grandma Rose had outlived both her husband and her children, leaving only us grandchildren behind. As the eldest son's son, I technically had as much right to sit there as anyone, but you wouldn't know it from the looks I was getting. "Excuse me," Miranda's voice cut through the funeral home's hushed atmosphere. "I think you're in the wrong section." I turned to face her, seeing the same sharp features that had made her beautiful in high school, but had hardened with age and entitlement. "This is where family sits," I said quietly. "Family that cared about her," Derek added, moving closer. His expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the smell of alcohol on his breath, even though it wasn't even noon yet. Family that visited her regularly, not just when they needed money. The accusation hit like a slap. It was true that I'd borrowed money from Grandma Rose over the years, but never more than a few $100s, and I'd always paid her back. When my truck needed repairs, when I was between jobs, when medical bills piled up after I broke my wrist on a construction site, she'd been there. But so had Derek and Miranda, asking for much larger sums to fund their business ventures and lifestyle choices. "She loved all of us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did she?" Uncle Victor's voice boomed across the room. He'd walked over with his entourage, creating a semicircle around me. "Because from what I hear, you spent an awful lot of time at her house these past few months, almost like you were working on something." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Other people in the funeral home were starting to stare now, drawn by the tension. I could see the funeral director hovering nearby, probably wondering if he needed to intervene. I spent time with her because she was lonely, I said, because the rest of you were too busy to visit. That's rich coming from you, Sandra, Derek's wife, stepped forward. She'd always been the most vocal about her disapproval of me. We all know why you were really there. Grandma wasn't thinking clearly at the end. Everyone could see that. She was sharper than any of us, I protested. Sharp enough to know a con artist when she saw one? Miranda's laugh was bitter. Please, you took advantage of an old woman's kindness, and now you're going to pretend you deserve to sit with real family? The words stung, because there was just enough truth in them to twist the knife. I had been at Grandma's house almost every day for the past 3 months, but not for the reasons they were suggesting. She'd been getting weaker, struggling with tasks that used to be simple. While they hired housekeepers and caregivers, I'd been the one fixing her leaky faucet, cleaning her gutters, and sitting with her during thunderstorms because they still scared her like they had when she was a little girl. Maybe we should wait for the reading of the will, Uncle Victor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then we'll see just how much your visits meant to her. The funeral service itself passed in a blur of hymns and memories that felt sanitized and hollow. The pastor, who'd met Grandma Rose exactly twice, spoke about her charitable nature and devotion to family. Derek gave a eulogy that painted her as the perfect grandmother, conveniently leaving out the years he'd ignored her calls because he was too busy climbing corporate ladders. I didn't speak. I'd wanted to, had prepared words about the woman who taught me to play chess and told me stories about growing up during the Depression, but the hostility radiating from my family made it clear that anything I said would be unwelcome. After the burial at Greenwood Cemetery, we all gathered back at the funeral home for the reading of the will. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the real reason most of them had shown up. Grandma Rose had been worth considerably more than most people knew. The oil wells on the family land still produced revenue. There were investments and properties, and rumors of savings accounts that hadn't been touched in decades. Attorney Margaret Chen arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She sat up at a small table near the front of the room, while everyone found seats. "Before we begin," she said, adjusting her reading glasses, "I want to make it clear that this will was prepared 6 months ago, witnessed properly, and filed according to all legal requirements. Mrs. Rose Thompson was of sound mind when she dictated these instructions to me." Derek and Miranda exchanged glances. Uncle Victor leaned forward in his chair. "The last will and testament of Rose Marie Thompson," Attorney Chen began reading. "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby distribute my earthly possessions as follows." The room was silent, except for the artificial hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. "To my grandson Derek Thompson, I leave my collection of china and crystal along with the sum of $50,000. Derek's face remained carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw. 50,000 was nowhere near what he'd been expecting. "To my granddaughter Miranda Patterson, I leave my jewelry collection and the sum of $50,000. Miranda's composure cracked slightly. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to object, but she caught herself. "To my brother-in-law Victor Thompson, I leave my gratitude for his years of financial advice and the sum of $25,000. Uncle Victor's face was turning red. $25,000 wasn't even enough to cover the taxes on his house for a year. Attorney Chen continued reading, smaller bequests to various cousins and family friends, each one met with visible disappointment from the recipients. The amounts were generous by normal standards, but modest compared to what everyone had been expecting from a woman worth millions. "And finally," Attorney Chen said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly tense room, "to my grandson Harry Anderson, who showed me more kindness in the last 3 months than I received from the rest of my family in the last 3 years, I leave the remainder of my estate." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that funeral home as everyone processed what they'd just heard. "The remainder," Attorney Chen continued, includes all properties, investments, business interests, and liquid assets not otherwise specified, with a current estimated value of $45 million. Then the explosion came. "This is impossible!" Derek shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "She couldn't have been thinking clearly." "It's fraud!" Miranda screamed, pointing at me like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He manipulated her. He took advantage. Inheritance thief. Uncle Victor's voice boomed over the chaos. "That's what you are, a common thief." The entire room erupted. Cousins I barely knew were shouting accusations, calling me names, demanding that the will be overturned. Someone threw a plastic water bottle that bounced off my shoulder. Sandra was crying angry tears while Paul tried to calm his wife down, but even he was glaring at me with pure hatred. "Inheritance thief! Inheritance thief!" The chant started with Miranda and spread through the room like wildfire. Even some of the funeral home staff had gathered in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. I sat frozen in my chair, overwhelmed by the venom being directed at me. These were people I'd grown up with, shared holidays with, called family. Now they were looking at me like I was their worst enemy. "How could you do this to us?" Derek demanded, stepping so close I could smell the alcohol on his breath again. "We're your family." "You destroyed everything," Miranda added, her perfectly applied makeup running down her cheeks. "Grandma would be rolling over in her grave if she knew what you'd done." Attorney Chen was trying to restore order, tapping her pen against the table and calling for quiet, but no one was listening. Uncle Victor was on his phone, probably calling his own lawyer. Several cousins were crying, others were shouting, and the general atmosphere felt like it might explode into actual violence. "This won't stand," Derek said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper as he leaned down toward me. "We'll fight this. We'll prove you manipulated her. We'll drag you through every court in the state until you don't have a penny left to your name." "You'll wish you'd never been born," Miranda added, her voice shaking with rage. I finally found my voice. I didn't know," I said quietly, but even I could barely hear myself over the chaos. "Liar!" someone shouted from the back of the room. "Thief! Con artist!" The names kept coming, each one hitting like a physical blow. I looked around the room at faces twisted with anger and greed and suddenly understood something that had been nagging at me for months. These people weren't grieving for Grandma Rose. They weren't mourning the loss of a beloved family matriarch. They were angry about money. Attorney Chen finally managed to get everyone's attention by standing up and speaking in a voice that commanded respect. "If anyone wishes to contest this will, you're free to do so through proper legal channels. However, I can assure you that Mrs. Thompson was thoroughly examined by medical professionals before making these arrangements. She was competent, she was clear about her intentions, and she had very specific reasons for her decisions." "What reasons?" Uncle Victor demanded. Attorney Chen looked directly at me for a moment, then back at the crowd. "That will become clear if and when any legal challenges are filed. For now, this reading is concluded." She began packing her papers back into the briefcase while the accusations continued to fly. I noticed she moved with practiced efficiency, like she'd dealt with family explosions before. As people started filing out, still muttering threats and making plans to fight the will, I remained in my chair. The weight of what had just happened was settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. $45 million! It was more money than I could even comprehend, more than I'd ever dreamed of having. But it came with a price I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. Every person in that room now saw me as their enemy. Family gatherings were over, holiday celebrations were finished. I was officially the black sheep, the outsider, the one who'd stolen their birthright. Derek was the last to leave, pausing at my chair to deliver one final threat. "This isn't over, Harry. We know what you did, and we're going to prove it. Enjoy the money while you can, because you won't have it long." After everyone left, I sat alone in the funeral home with my thoughts. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty chairs. I could still smell the lilies from Grandma's flower arrangements, still hear the echo of angry voices calling me a thief. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Grandma Rose, just 3 days before she passed. She'd been in her hospital bed, weak but alert, holding my hand with fingers that felt like paper. "Harry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "promise me something." "Anything, Grandma. Promise me you won't let them make you feel guilty about who you are. You have a good heart, and that's rarer than they know." At the time, I'd thought she was just giving me general life advice. Now I wondered if she'd known exactly what was coming. The funeral director approached hesitantly, probably wanting to close up for the day. "Mr. Anderson, is there anything else we can do for you?" I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting in shock for so long. "No," I said. "I think I'm done here." As I walked out to my pickup truck, I passed the luxury cars my cousins had arrived in. Most of them were already gone, probably heading to emergency family meetings to plan their legal strategy. I climbed into my truck and sat for a moment, looking back at the funeral home where everything had changed. My phone was buzzing with text messages, but I didn't need to read them to know what they said. More accusations, more threats, more family members choosing sides in a war I never wanted to fight. I drove home through the wealthy neighborhoods again, but this time something felt different. The houses looked smaller somehow, less impressive. Maybe it was because I now technically had more money than most of their owners, or maybe it was because I'd seen what the pursuit of wealth could do to people's souls. Back in my studio apartment, I sat on my second-hand couch and tried to process what had happened. $45 million! The number kept bouncing around in my head like a pinball, never quite landing anywhere that made sense. I pulled out the photo of me and Grandma Rose from my wallet, the one I'd been carrying since Christmas. She was smiling in that picture, genuinely happy, not the brittle social smile I'd seen her wear around the rest of the family. I remembered how she used to tell me stories about the early days when the family was poor and everyone worked together just to survive. "Money changes people," she'd said once while we were sitting on her porch watching the sunset. "Sometimes for the better, but usually for the worse. The trick is remembering who you were before you had it." Now I was about to find out if I could follow her advice. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Attorney Chen's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mr. Anderson," she said when I answered, "I wanted to check on you after this afternoon. I know that couldn't have been easy." "I'm okay," I lied. "No, you're not," she said gently. And that's normal. I've been handling estate cases for 15 years, and family reactions like that never get easier to watch. "Did you know?" I asked. "About the amount, I mean?" "Yes, your grandmother was very specific about her wishes. She also anticipated the reaction you received today." "She did?" "Mr. Anderson, would you be available to meet tomorrow morning? There are some things your grandmother wanted me to explain to you privately, things that might help you understand her decision." I agreed to meet her at her office the next morning, then hung up and stared at the photo again. Whatever Grandma Rose had been planning, she'd kept it completely secret from me. I'd spent months visiting her, helping with small tasks, listening to her stories, never knowing that she was evaluating not just my character, but the character of everyone else in the family. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voices calling me a thief, saw the hatred in my cousins' faces, felt the weight of accusation and resentment that would follow me for the rest of my life. I kept thinking about what Derek had said, that they would fight the will and take everything away from me. Part of me almost hoped they would succeed. The money felt like a burden I wasn't equipped to carry, especially if it meant losing my family in the process. But another part of me, the part that remembered every slight and dismissal and condescending comment I'd endured over the years, was starting to feel something different. Maybe it was time to stop apologizing for who I was. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made coffee, sitting at my small kitchen table while rain continued to tap against the windows. I thought about all the times my cousins had made me feel like an outsider at family gatherings, all the jokes about my blue-collar job and modest lifestyle, all the ways they'd made it clear that I didn't quite belong in their world. Well, now their world belonged to me. As the sun came up, painting the sky outside my window in shades of orange and pink, I made a decision. I wouldn't apologize for Grandma Rose's choice. I wouldn't feel guilty for accepting her gift. And I wouldn't let my family's greed and entitlement make me question my own worth. But first, I needed to understand what Grandma Rose had really been thinking. I needed to know why she'd chosen me, and what she'd expected me to do with the responsibility she'd placed on my shoulders. Attorney Chen's office was in a modest building downtown, nothing like the gleaming skyscrapers where Uncle Victor conducted his business. The waiting room was small and comfortable, with worn leather chairs and law books lining the walls. It felt like the kind of place where real work got done, not just impressive deals designed to generate headlines. Margaret Chen greeted me with a warm handshake and led me into her private office. It was cluttered with case files and legal documents, but somehow organized in a way that made sense to her. She offered me coffee, which I accepted gratefully. "Before we discuss your grandmother's specific instructions," she said, settling behind her desk, "I want you to understand something about the legal challenges you're likely to face." I leaned forward, suddenly alert. "Your cousins will probably try to prove that Mrs. Thompson was mentally incapacitated when she made this will, or that you exerted undue influence over her. These are common tactics in contested estate cases. And will they succeed?" Attorney Chen smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Your grandmother was very thorough in protecting her decision. She had multiple medical evaluations performed in the months before her death, all confirming her mental competency. She also documented her reasons for choosing you in great detail. She opened a thick file folder and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma Rose's careful handwriting. She asked me to give this to you after the will reading, once you'd had time to process what happened." My hands shook slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written on Grandma's personal stationery, the kind with her initials embossed at the top. "My dear Harry," it began, and I could almost hear her voice speaking the words. "If you're reading this, then Margaret has followed my instructions and you've learned about my gift to you. I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed, confused, and probably hurt by your family's reaction. All of these feelings are normal and expected." I looked up at Attorney Chen, who was watching me carefully. "She wrote this 6 months ago," she said, "long before her final illness." I continued reading. "I want you to know that my decision was not made lightly or hastily. I've spent the last year watching how different members of our family treat others, especially those they consider beneath them. I've seen who visits out of love and who visits out of obligation. I've observed who asks about my health and who asks about my assets." The letter went on to describe specific incidents I remembered well. The time Derek had yelled at a waitress for bringing the wrong order during a family dinner, the way Miranda spoke to service workers like they were invisible, the Christmas gathering where Uncle Victor had spent the entire evening on his phone, conducting business deals while the rest of us tried to celebrate. But you, Harry, have shown me something different. You see people as human beings, not as tools to be used or obstacles to be overcome. When Mrs. Patterson from next door needed help bringing in her groceries, you didn't wait to be asked. When the young man who delivers my newspaper was struggling with his bike chain, you stopped to help him fix it. These acts of kindness might seem small to you, but they reveal the content of your character." I had to stop reading for a moment. Mrs. Patterson was an elderly widow who lived alone, and the newspaper delivery boy couldn't have been more than 16. I'd never thought of helping them as anything special, just basic human decency. "Your grandmother also wanted you to know about some specific incidents," Attorney Chen said quietly. things that influenced her decision that you might not be aware of. She pulled out another document, this one typed rather than handwritten. Last spring, when your cousin Derek was going through his divorce, he asked your grandmother for a loan of $200,000 to pay his legal fees. She agreed, but she also hired a private investigator to see how he was spending the money. I looked up in surprise. She did what? Your grandmother was not as trusting as people assumed. The investigator discovered that Derek was using the money to fund a gambling addiction, not legal fees. When she confronted him about it, he became verbally abusive and threatened to cut off contact with her if she didn't give him more money. My mouth fell open. I'd known Derek had problems, but I'd never imagined anything like this. There are similar reports about Miranda and Uncle Victor, Attorney Chen continued, instances of financial manipulation, emotional abuse, and outright threats when your grandmother tried to set boundaries. She handed me a folder containing photographs, bank records, and what looked like private investigator reports. Your grandmother documented everything. She wanted you to understand that her decision wasn't about favoritism or sentimentality. It was about ensuring that her legacy would be protected by someone with genuine integrity. I flipped through the documents, my anger growing with each page. There were photos of Derek at casinos, records of Miranda's husband using family connections to secure fraudulent business deals, evidence of Uncle Victor pressuring Grandma Rose to change her will in his favor. They all knew, I said quietly. They knew she was investigating them, which is why they're so desperate to overturn the will, Attorney Chen confirmed. If this information becomes public during legal proceedings, it will destroy their reputations and possibly result in criminal charges. I set the folder down and looked out the window at the busy street below. People were going about their normal lives, unaware that my entire world had shifted on its axis. Yesterday, I'd been a construction worker struggling to pay rent. Today, I was a millionaire holding evidence that could send my family members to prison. What am I supposed to do with all this? I asked. Attorney Chen leaned back in her chair. That's entirely up to you. Your grandmother's letter contains some suggestions, but ultimately, the choice is yours. I picked up Grandma Rose's letter again and continued reading where I'd left off. Harry, I know this responsibility feels overwhelming, but I believe you're the only person in our family capable of using this wealth wisely. You've seen what money can do to people's character when they don't have to work for it. You've watched your cousins become entitled and cruel, treating others as disposable resources rather than fellow human beings. The letter went on to outline specific ways she hoped I would use the inheritance. Charitable donations to organizations that helped working families, scholarships for students who couldn't afford college, investments in local businesses that created good jobs for ordinary people. But most importantly, the letter continued, I want you to remember that money is not a measure of your worth as a person. You were valuable to me long before you inherited a penny, and you'll be valuable regardless of how much money you have in the bank. Don't let wealth change who you are at your core. The final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. I love you, Harry, not because of what you might do for me, but because of who you are. You have your grandfather's kindness and your mother's strength, and I'm proud to call you my grandson. Use this gift wisely, but don't let it become a burden that steals your joy. Life is too short to spend it worrying about what others think of your good fortune. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Attorney Chen was watching me with a sympathetic expression. She really thought this through, I said. Your grandmother was one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, she replied. She understood that leaving you this inheritance would cause family problems, but she believed you were strong enough to handle it. And if I'm not, then you'll figure it out as you go. That's what she would have told you. We spent the next hour going over practical matters. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, property deeds, business partnerships. The scope of Grandma Rose's wealth was staggering. She owned oil wells, real estate developments, technology stocks, and art collections I'd never known existed. Your first priority should be securing everything legally, Attorney Chen advised. Your family will challenge the will, probably within the next few days. We need to be prepared with documentation proving your grandmother's competency and their history of financial abuse." I nodded, though my head was spinning with information overload. "There's one more thing," she said, pulling out a small key. "Your grandmother asked me to give you this. It opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. She said you'd understand what to do with what you find inside." The key was old and worn, made of brass that had been handled countless times. I turned it over in my palm, wondering what other secrets Grandma Rose had been keeping. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said to Attorney Chen. "Of course. Do you think I deserve this?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "Mr. Anderson, in my experience, the people who ask that question are usually the ones who deserve it most. The people who assume they deserve everything rarely question their own worthiness." I left her office with a briefcase full of documents and a head full of questions. The safety deposit box was my next stop, but first I needed to process everything I'd learned about my family's behavior. The evidence in those files painted a picture of people I thought I knew, revealing sides of them I'd never suspected. Derek's gambling addiction explained a lot about his recent behavior. The mood swings and financial stress I'd attributed to his divorce. Miranda's husband's business dealings clarified why they'd been so concerned about Grandma Rose's investments lately. And Uncle Victor's threats made sense now that I knew he'd been pressuring her to change her will in his favor. I felt like I'd been living in a house of mirrors, seeing distorted reflections of reality while the truth remained hidden behind the glass. First National Bank was a stately old building with marble columns and brass fixtures, the kind of place that projected stability and trustworthiness. The safety deposit box was in the basement, behind multiple security doors and under the watchful eye of bank employees who looked like they'd been there since the building opened. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, big enough to hold several file folders and some items wrapped in cloth. I spread everything out on the small table in the private viewing room, feeling like an archaeologist uncovering ancient secrets. The first item was a handwritten journal, bound in leather and filled with Grandma Rose's careful script. I opened it to the first page and found a date from 3 years ago, right around the time Grandpa had passed away. "Today I buried my husband of 52 years," the entry began. "The funeral was beautiful, the flowers were perfect, and my family played their parts admirably. But as I watched my children and grandchildren interact with each other and with the people who came to pay their respects, I realized something troubling. Somewhere along the way, we've lost our way." The journal chronicled 3 years of observations about family behavior. Grandma Rose had been keeping detailed notes about conversations, interactions, and incidents that revealed everyone's true character. She'd been conducting her own quiet investigation, trying to understand what had happened to the family values she and Grandpa had tried to instill. One entry particularly stood out. "Harry helped me clean out Arthur's workshop today. While we worked, he found some of Arthur's old tools and asked if he could have them, not because they were valuable, but because he wanted to remember his grandfather's hands holding them. When I said yes, he spent an hour cleaning and organizing them with the kind of reverence you usually only see in church. Later, Derek stopped by and immediately noticed the antique clock Arthur had kept in the workshop. He wanted to know how much it was worth and whether I planned to sell it. The difference in their reactions told me everything I needed to know about their hearts. I remembered that day clearly. Grandpa's workshop had been his sanctuary, filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects. Cleaning it out had felt sacred somehow, like we were handling pieces of his soul. The tools Derek had dismissed as junk were treasures to me because they connected me to the man who taught me that honest work was the foundation of a meaningful life. The second item in the safety deposit box was a folder containing financial records going back decades. These weren't the same documents Attorney Chen had shown me. These were older, detailing the family's rise from poverty to wealth and the gradual changes in behavior that accompanied their growing fortune. There were copies of letters Grandpa had written to his children, warning them about the dangers of inherited wealth and encouraging them to teach their own children the value of hard work. There were records of family meetings where he'd tried to establish charitable foundations and giving programs, most of which had been opposed by Uncle Victor and the other relatives who preferred to keep the money within the family. The final item was a small wooden box containing a collection of items that seemed random at first. A dried flower from Grandma Rose's wedding bouquet, a ticket stub from a movie she and Grandpa had seen on their first date, a photograph of the family's original homestead, a modest farmhouse that had been torn down decades ago to make room for oil derricks. At the bottom of the box was a small note in Grandma Rose's handwriting. "These are the things that matter. Remember where we came from, and don't let money make you forget who we were before we had it." I sat in that quiet viewing room for over an hour, reading through the journal and studying the old photographs. The picture that emerged was of a family that had started with strong values and genuine love for each other, but had gradually been corrupted by wealth and the power it brought. Grandpa Arthur came across as a man who'd been deeply troubled by what he saw happening to his children. He'd tried to use his wealth responsibly, supporting charities and helping working families in the community. But as he'd gotten older and less able to control how the family money was used, he'd watched his descendants become exactly the kind of people he'd always disliked. One journal entry from Grandma Rose particularly stood out. Arthur used to say that money is like fertilizer. Spread it around wisely and it helps everything grow. But pile it all in one place and it just creates a stinking mess. I'm afraid we've created quite a stink. By the time I left the bank, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the downtown streets. I walked slowly back to my truck, carrying the briefcase and the wooden box, feeling the weight of generations of family history on my shoulders. My phone had been buzzing with messages all day, but I'd been ignoring them. Now I finally checked to see what I'd missed. Most were from family members, variations on the same anger and accusation. But there were also messages from people I barely knew, distant relatives and family friends who'd heard about the will reading and wanted to offer their congratulations or their opinions about what I should do with the money. One message stood out from the rest. It was from Sarah Martinez, a woman who'd worked as Grandma Rose's housekeeper for the past 5 years. I'd gotten to know her during my visits, and she'd always struck me as genuinely caring about Grandma's well-being rather than just collecting a paycheck. "Harry," her message read, "I heard about what happened at the funeral home. I wanted you to know that your grandmother talked about you all the time, always with such pride and love. She used to say that you were the only one who visited her because you wanted to be there, not because you felt obligated. She was so happy that you would inherit everything because she knew you would use it to help people, just like she and your grandfather always tried to do." Don't let the others make you feel bad about her choice. She was thinking clearly right up until the end, and she chose you for all the right reasons. The message brought tears to my eyes, both for its kindness and for the validation it provided. Sarah had been there for Grandma Rose's final months, watching the family dynamics play out from the perspective of someone who had no financial stake in the outcome. Her observations carried weight because she had nothing to gain from defending Grandma's decision. I drove home as the sun was setting, thinking about everything I'd learned. The family I thought I knew was a carefully constructed facade, hiding years of manipulation and greed. But more importantly, I was beginning to understand that Grandma Rose's gift wasn't just about money. It was about restoring the family's original values, the ones that had been lost along the way. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 cars parked outside my apartment building. I recognized Derek's BMW immediately, but the other 2 were unfamiliar. Through my window, I could see several people standing near the entrance, apparently waiting for me to emerge. I called Attorney Chen from my kitchen phone, keeping my voice low even though I was 3 floors up. "They're outside my building," I told her. "Who's outside your building?" "Derek, Miranda, some people I don't recognize. They look like they're waiting for me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Anderson, I think you should consider staying somewhere else for a few days, until we can get a restraining order if necessary." "A restraining order? Against my own family? Your family just lost $45 million they considered theirs. People have done worse things for far less money. The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. These weren't just angry relatives anymore. They were people with millions of reasons to hate me. There's a back exit through the building's service entrance, I said, thinking out loud. I could get out without them seeing me. Good. Pack a bag and go somewhere they won't think to look for you. A hotel, a friend's house, anywhere but obvious places. I threw some clothes into a duffel bag and grabbed the briefcase containing all of Grandma Rose's documents. The wooden box from the safety deposit box went into the bag as well. If I was going into hiding, I wanted the evidence with me. The service exit led to an alley behind the building where residents sometimes parked overflow vehicles. My truck was in the main lot, clearly visible to anyone watching the front entrance, but I had another option. Mrs. Chen from the second floor had mentioned that her son's motorcycle was stored in the basement garage and rarely used. I'd helped her move some furniture a few months ago, and she'd given me the garage code in case of emergencies. 20 minutes later, I was riding through downtown traffic on a 10-year-old Honda, wearing a borrowed helmet and hoping my family wouldn't recognize me. The bike was smaller than I was used to, but it was perfect for blending into city traffic and avoiding detection. I ended up at a modest motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that catered to traveling salespeople and construction crews. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and anonymous. I paid cash for 3 nights and registered under a false name, feeling like a character in a crime novel. Once I was settled in the small room, I spread Grandma Rose's documents across the bed and began studying them more carefully. The journal entries painted an increasingly disturbing picture of family behavior over the past 3 years. What I'd initially seen as isolated incidents of bad judgment were actually part of a pattern of escalating greed and manipulation. The entry that affected me most was dated just 2 months ago. Harry came by today to fix the leak in my bathroom sink. While he worked, Derek called to ask about borrowing money for a business opportunity. When I asked for details, he became evasive and eventually angry. He said I was being unreasonable for questioning his judgment, that I should trust family members more than strangers. After I hung up, Harry asked if everything was okay. When I explained about Derek's call, Harry said, "Maybe you should get more information before you decide. 60 years of marriage taught me to trust but verify." It was exactly what Arthur would have said. I remembered that conversation, though I hadn't known about Derek's phone call at the time. Grandma had seemed upset about something, and I'd assumed it was the plumbing problem. The fact that she'd compared my advice to Grandpa's reaction meant more to me than any amount of money. My phone rang, interrupting my reading. The caller ID showed Sarah Martinez's number. "Harry," she said when I answered, her voice tense with worry, "are you okay? Some men came to Mrs. Thompson's house this morning asking questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "They wanted to know how often you visited, whether you ever asked about her finances, if you seemed interested in her will. They said they were private investigators working for the family." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That you came by almost every day for the past few months, but you never asked about money or inheritance. You always asked about her health and whether she needed anything. You fixed things around the house, brought groceries, sat with her during storms. You treated her like a beloved grandmother, not like a bank account." "Sarah, I need you to be careful. These people are angry about the will, and they might try to pressure you to change your story." "Let them try," she said firmly. "I worked for your grandmother for 5 years. I know the difference between someone who cares and someone who's pretending to care. Your cousins never visited unless they wanted something. You visited because you loved her." After we hung up, I realized that Sarah's testimony would be crucial if the will was challenged in court. She was an unbiased observer who'd witnessed the family dynamics firsthand. But that also made her a target for intimidation. I called Attorney Chen again to update her on the situation. "We need to document everything," she said. "Every contact from family members, every attempt at intimidation, every conversation with potential witnesses. If this goes to court, we want to show a pattern of harassment and coercion." "How long could a court case take?" Months, possibly years. Estate litigation can be very complicated, especially when this much money is involved. The thought of years of legal battles was exhausting, but I was beginning to understand that this was about more than money. This was about honoring Grandma Rose's wishes and protecting the legacy she'd tried to preserve. That afternoon, I decided to visit some of the properties mentioned in the inheritance documents. If I was going to be responsible for managing this wealth, I needed to understand what I'd inherited. The first stop was a small apartment complex on the north side of town. According to the files, Grandma Rose had owned this property for over 20 years, using the rental income to fund various charitable projects. The building was modest but well-maintained, with mature trees providing shade for the parking areas. I introduced myself to the property manager, a middle-aged woman named Carol who'd worked there for 15 years. When I explained who I was, her face lit up with recognition. "You're Mrs. Thompson's grandson," she said. "She talked about you all the time, always so proud of your work ethic and kindness." What was she like as a landlord? Carol's expression grew thoughtful. Fair but firm. She kept the rents reasonable because she said working families deserved decent housing they could afford. When tenants had temporary financial problems, she'd work with them instead of rushing to evict. But she also expected people to take care of the property and respect their neighbors. As we walked through the building, Carol pointed out recent improvements Grandma Rose had funded. New windows, updated electrical systems, a playground for children. These weren't the actions of someone interested only in profit. "There's something else you should know," Carol said as we finished our tour. "Yesterday, a man came by claiming to represent the new ownership. He wanted to see all the financial records and started talking about raising rents significantly." "What man?" "He said his name was Victor Thompson. He claimed the property would be sold soon and new management would be taking over." Uncle Victor had been busy. He was apparently trying to take control of properties that legally belonged to me, probably hoping to create facts on the ground that would be hard to reverse later. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd need written authorization from the property owner before sharing any information. He got pretty angry and said I'd be looking for a new job soon." I assured Carol that her job was secure and that any changes to property management would be discussed with her first. The relief on her face reminded me that my decisions would affect real people's lives, not just abstract financial portfolios. The second property was more surprising. According to the documents, Grandma Rose owned a small grocery store in a working-class neighborhood across town. I'd never known about this investment, but when I arrived at Martinez Family Market, I understood why she'd kept it quiet. The store was clearly struggling. The parking lot needed repairs, several windows were cracked, and the interior felt dated compared to the modern chain stores nearby. But it was clean and well organized, and the elderly man behind the counter greeted every customer by name. I waited until the store was empty, then introduced myself to the owner, Eduardo Martinez. He was Sarah's father, I learned, which explained the connection. "Mr. Anderson," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "Sarah told me you might come by. I'm so sorry for your loss. Mrs. Thompson was a wonderful woman." "I didn't know my grandmother was involved with your store." Eduardo's eyes filled with tears. 5 years ago, we were going to lose everything. The big chain stores were taking our customers, we couldn't keep up with the rent, the suppliers wanted payment up front. Mrs. Thompson heard about our situation through Sarah and offered to help." "How did she help?" "She bought the building and gave us a lease we could afford. She also lent us money to update the inventory and make some improvements. But most importantly, she never made us feel like charity cases. She said small businesses were the backbone of the community and deserved support." As Eduardo showed me around the store, I began to understand another facet of Grandma Rose's character. She hadn't just inherited wealth, she'd used it to support the kind of businesses and people that larger economic forces were pushing aside. "There's something troubling I need to tell you," Eduardo said as we finished the tour. "This morning, a man came here demanding to see our lease agreement and financial records. He said the property was being sold and we'd need to find somewhere else." "Uncle Victor again." "I think so. He was very aggressive, said things were going to change now that Mrs. Thompson was gone. He implied that our lease wouldn't be honored by the new owners." I assured Eduardo that nothing would change without proper notice and discussion. But privately, I was becoming alarmed by Uncle Victor's apparent strategy of intimidating tenants and employees before any legal challenges to the will had even been filed. That evening, back at the motel, I called Attorney Chen to report these developments. "He's trying to create a crisis," she said after I'd explained Uncle Victor's activities. "If he can disrupt the properties and businesses, he can argue that you're not capable of managing the inheritance responsibly." "Can he do that legally?" "No, but he can create a lot of problems that will take time and money to resolve. We need to move quickly to protect the assets and notify everyone that Victor has no authority to make changes." "What about getting a restraining order?" "I'll file the paperwork tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I want you to stay where you are and avoid contact with any family members." After we hung up, I sat on the motel bed studying the documents again. The scope of Grandma Rosa's investments was becoming clearer, and it painted a picture of someone who'd used wealth as a tool for community building rather than personal aggrandizement. There were scholarship funds for local students, grants for small businesses, donations to food banks and homeless shelters. She'd also invested in several startup companies owned by minorities and women, apparently more interested in supporting diverse entrepreneurs than maximizing returns. But there was one document that puzzled me. It was a recent contract with a private investigation firm dated just 3 months before Grandma Rosa's death. The contract was vague about the specific services provided, mentioning only family security assessment and background verification services. I called the investigation firm the next morning, identifying myself as the executor of Rose Thompson's estate. The receptionist transferred me to a senior investigator named James Morrison. "Mr. Anderson," he said when I explained who I was, "I've been expecting your call. Mrs. Thompson asked me to compile a comprehensive report on family financial activities. She was concerned about some irregularities she'd noticed." "What kind of irregularities?" "It would be better if we met in person. Are you available this afternoon?" We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, away from both the motel and any places my family might think to look for me. Morrison turned out to be a retired police detective, probably in his 60s, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades dealing with family disputes and financial crimes. "Your grandmother hired me after she discovered some unauthorized access to her investment accounts," he began, pulling out a thick folder. "Someone had been using her financial information to make inquiries about account balances and transaction histories." "Someone in the family?" "Victor Thompson. He'd been calling investment firms and banks, claiming to be acting on your grandmother's behalf. Most institutions are careful about sharing information, but he'd apparently managed to get some details about her holdings." Morrison showed me copies of phone records and financial institution reports documenting Uncle Victor's activities. The pattern was clear. He'd been systematically trying to map Grandma Rosa's wealth for months before her death. "That's not all," Morrison continued. "We also investigated some of the financial requests your family members had made to your grandmother in recent years. The results were interesting." He opened another section of the folder, revealing bank records and credit reports for Derek, Miranda, and Uncle Victor. Derek's gambling addiction was worse than anyone knew. He'd lost over $300,000 in the past 2 years, mostly at casinos, but also through online betting. The money he borrowed from Grandma Rose had gone directly to paying gambling debts, not legal fees as he'd claimed. Miranda and her husband had been running a fraudulent investment scheme, using the family name to attract investors to non-existent development projects. They'd already been investigated by state regulators and were facing potential criminal charges. Uncle Victor's situation was the most complex. He'd been using his position as unofficial family financial advisor to skim money from various accounts. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate detection, but over several years, he'd stolen nearly $500,000. "Your grandmother was planning to confront all of them after the holidays," Morrison said. "She wanted to give them a chance to explain and make restitution before taking legal action." "But she died before she could do that." "Yes, which means the evidence is still there, but no formal complaints have been filed." I stared at the documents, feeling sick to my stomach. These weren't just family disagreements about money. These were serious crimes committed by people I'd trusted and loved. "There's one more thing," Morrison said quietly. We found evidence that Victor has been planning to challenge your grandmother's will for months. He'd already consulted with lawyers and was preparing arguments about her mental competency before she even died. That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Victor hadn't just been disappointed by the will reading, he'd been actively working to overturn it before he even knew what it contained. He was that certain she'd leave him everything? No, I think he was that certain he could convince a court that any will that didn't favor him must be invalid. I left the meeting with copies of Morrison's complete report, feeling like I was carrying evidence of my family's complete moral collapse. The people who'd raised me, who'd taught me about loyalty and responsibility, had been systematically stealing and lying for years. But I also felt something else: validation. Grandma Rose's decision to leave everything to me wasn't sentimental or impulsive. It was based on careful investigation and clear evidence of everyone else's untrustworthiness. That afternoon, I called Sarah Martinez and asked if she could meet me somewhere private. We agreed on a small diner outside of town, the kind of place where we could talk without worrying about being overheard. Sarah arrived looking worried and tired. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we settled into a back booth. "I'm learning things about my family that I wish I didn't know," I said honestly. "Your grandmother knew," Sarah said quietly. "She never told me details, but she'd been asking a lot of questions about phone calls and visitors. She was suspicious about something." I showed her some of the less sensitive documents from Morrison's report, enough to explain why Grandma Rose had been concerned, but not enough to compromise any potential legal proceedings. "This explains so much," Sarah said after reading through the papers. She'd been acting differently the past few months, more guarded, more careful about what she said around certain people. "Did she ever talk to you about the will?" "Not directly, but she did say something that stuck with me. She said she'd been thinking about legacy, about what kind of world she wanted to leave behind. She said money could either build people up or tear them down, and she was worried about which direction her family was heading." As we talked, I realized that Sarah had been Grandma Rose's closest confidant during her final months. While the family was focused on social visits and financial requests, Sarah had been the one listening to her fears and concerns about the future. "She loved you," Sarah said as our conversation wound down. "Not because of what you might inherit, but because you reminded her of your grandfather. She used to say you had his heart." "What was he like? Really, I mean, not the sanitized version everyone talks about at family gatherings." Sarah smiled for the first time since we'd met. "Strong but gentle. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. He treated everyone with respect, from bank presidents to janitors. Your grandmother said he judged people by their actions, not their words." "And he would have approved of her decision?" "Absolutely. He always said character mattered more than blood relations." Driving back to the motel that evening, I thought about what Grandpa Arthur would have done in my situation. According to Grandma Rose's journal, he'd faced similar challenges when he was building the family fortune, dealing with relatives who prioritized personal gain over family unity. But he'd also been guided by clear principles: work hard, treat people fairly, use wealth responsibly, and never let money become more important than relationships. The fact that those principles had been abandoned by his children and grandchildren would have broken his heart. I spent that night reading through more of Grandma Rose's journal entries, looking for guidance about how to handle the situation I'd inherited along with the money. One entry from 6 months ago provided some insight. Arthur used to say that wealth was a test of character, not a reward for good behavior. Some people become more generous when they have more to give. Others become more selfish when they have more to protect. The challenge is making sure the money serves your values instead of your values serving the money. Another entry from just a month before her death was even more direct. "I've decided to give Harry everything because he's the only one who doesn't want it for the wrong reasons. Derek wants money to fund his addiction. Miranda wants money to maintain her lifestyle. Victor wants money to control other people. But Harry just wants enough to live comfortably and help others when he can. That's exactly the kind of person who should be trusted with real wealth. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from Attorney Chen. "Harry, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "Victor filed a petition to have the will declared invalid. He's claiming your grandmother was mentally incompetent and that you exercised undue influence over her." "How is that possible? You said you had medical evaluations proving her competency." "We do, but Victor has found a doctor willing to testify that those evaluations were inadequate. He's also claiming that your frequent visits in her final months constituted a pattern of manipulation." I felt my stomach drop. What does that mean for the inheritance? "It means everything gets frozen until the court case is resolved. You won't be able to access any of the accounts or make any changes to the properties. Victor is also asking the court to appoint him as temporary administrator of the estate." "Can he do that?" "He can try. We'll fight it, but court battles like this can take months or even years to resolve." After hanging up, I sat in the motel room staring at the wall. Uncle Victor was moving faster than I'd expected, and he apparently had more resources at his disposal than I'd realized. The prospect of years of legal warfare was daunting, especially since I had no experience with the justice system. But then I remembered something from Grandpa Arthur's old letters that I'd found in the safety deposit box. He'd written about facing down business rivals who'd tried to use legal intimidation to force him out of deals. His advice had been simple: never let lawyers become more important than facts. If you're in the right, the truth will eventually win. I called Morrison, the private investigator, and asked if he could accelerate his investigation into Uncle Victor's financial activities. "How much acceleration are we talking about?" "I need everything within a week, whatever it costs." "That'll require bringing in additional investigators and working around the clock. It won't be cheap." "Price is no object. I need to know everything Uncle Victor has been doing, everyone he's been talking to, and everyone who might be helping him." Morrison agreed to expand the investigation, and we arranged to meet again in 3 days to review his findings. That afternoon, I got another unexpected call, this time from Derek. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Harry," his voice was strained, almost pleading, "we need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea." "Listen, I know things got heated at the funeral home, but we're still family. This whole situation is tearing everyone apart." "The situation you created by challenging the will?" "That was Victor's idea, not mine." "Look, maybe we can work something out. You don't need $45 million. Nobody needs that much money." I could hear the desperation in his voice, and I wondered how much gambling debt was driving his sudden desire for reconciliation. "What are you proposing?" "Split it evenly among all the grandchildren. That's what Grandma really would have wanted. Fair treatment for everyone."
Fair treatment, I repeated. Like the fair treatment you gave Grandma when you lied about how you were spending the money she lent you? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I don't know what you're talking about," Derek said finally, but his voice had lost its persuasive tone. "I think you do. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. Harry, listen to me. Victor is planning to destroy you in court. He's got lawyers, investigators, witnesses. You're just a construction worker. You can't fight that kind of legal firepower." "Maybe not," I said, "but I can try." "This isn't a game," Derek's voice cracked. "There's too much money at stake. People are going to get hurt." "People are already getting hurt. Tenants are being threatened, employees are being intimidated, and everyone who cared about Grandma is being harassed." "That's not what I meant," Derek said quietly. The implication hung in the air between us. Derek was warning me that the family might resort to more than legal challenges if I didn't cooperate. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to protect you. There are things happening that you don't understand. Victor is not going to let this go." "Then maybe Victor needs to understand that I'm not going to let it go either." I hung up and immediately called Attorney Chen to report the conversation. "That sounds like intimidation," she said after I'd recounted Derek's words. "Document everything, the exact time of the call, what was said, the tone of voice. If this escalates, we'll need evidence of harassment." "Derek seemed scared," I said, "like he was warning me about something specific. Or like he was trying to scare you into giving up. Either way, be careful. When this much money is involved, people don't always think rationally." That evening, I decided to visit one more property from Grandma Rose's portfolio. According to the documents, she owned a small community center in an economically disadvantaged part of town. The building housed after-school programs, job training classes, and community meetings. The center was bustling with activity when I arrived. Children were working on homework in one room while their parents attended an English language class next door. In the basement, a group of adults was learning basic computer skills. The director, an energetic woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, greeted me warmly when I introduced myself. "You're Mrs. Thompson's grandson," she said with genuine excitement. "She talked about you constantly. She was so proud of your work ethic and your kindness to others." I didn't know she was involved with the community center. Involved? She saved this place. 5 years ago, we were going to lose our funding and shut down. Mrs. Thompson not only bought the building, she also established an endowment to cover operating expenses. Dr. Williams showed me around the center, explaining the various programs and their impact on the community. Hundreds of families depended on the services provided here, from childcare to job training to citizenship classes. "There's something you should know," Dr. Williams said as we finished our tour. "Yesterday, a man came here claiming that the center would be closed soon. He said the building was being sold and we'd need to vacate within 30 days. Let me guess. Victor Thompson? Yes, he was very aggressive, said things were changing now that Mrs. Thompson was gone. He implied that community programs were not a good use of valuable real estate." I assured Dr. Williams that the center would continue operating as normal, but privately, I was furious. Uncle Victor wasn't just trying to steal money, he was threatening to destroy programs that helped vulnerable families. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of hiding in the motel and reacting to Uncle Victor's moves, I was going to go on the offensive. I called Morrison and told him to expedite the investigation even further. "I want everything you can find on Victor Thompson, Derek Thompson, Miranda Patterson, and anyone else who might be working with them. Financial records, phone records, association patterns, everything." "That's going to require some creative investigation techniques," Morrison warned. "Not everything will be admissible in court." "I'm not worried about court admissibility right now. I'm worried about protecting the people and programs that my grandmother cared about." Morrison agreed to provide whatever information he could gather, regardless of legal constraints. I also called Attorney Chen and asked her to prepare for an aggressive legal strategy. Instead of just defending against Victor's challenge, I want to go after him for theft, fraud, and harassment. If he wants a legal war, let's give him one. "That's a risky strategy," she warned. "If you lose, you could end up with nothing." "If I do nothing, Uncle Victor will destroy everything Grandma Rose built anyway. At least this way, I'm fighting for something worthwhile." The next morning, I checked out of the motel and drove to the downtown hotel where I'd booked a suite under my real name. If my family wanted to find me, they could. I was done hiding. I spent the day meeting with property managers, community leaders, and business owners who'd been affected by Uncle Victor's intimidation campaign. Each conversation reinforced my understanding of how many people depended on Grandma Rose's investments in charitable activities. These weren't abstract financial portfolios. They were housing for working families, jobs for immigrants, educational opportunities for children, and hope for people who'd been written off by larger society. That evening, I called a family meeting. I sent text messages to Derek, Miranda, Uncle Victor, and several other relatives asking them to meet me at Grandma Rose's house the next morning. I wanted to have this conversation, on her territory, surrounded by the memories of what our family used to represent. Most of them agreed to come, probably curious about what I had to say and hoping to convince me to surrender without a court battle. As I sat in my hotel room that night, preparing for what would probably be the most important conversation of my life, I thought about Grandma Rose's journal entry about legacy. She'd written, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. Legacy is what you inspire others to become." Tomorrow, I would find out what kind of legacy I was capable of creating. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.